welcome back to the 8th podcast in the series. This week we're discussing the best films of the 1990s. And I'm here with Chris, twirling his mustache, Dawn, and Kev looking like prisoner Charles Bronson. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So every week, shit.
I feel like you were waiting for us to do something, and then we'd already all waved, except for Kev, who doesn't.
I'm definitely cutting out me saying hello, everyone, then the awkward pause is done.
Stilted before we even fucking started having a discussion.
The morning ones are always interesting.
Not a good sign.
No, it's not. So every week we summarise what was going on in the decade, and this week, for the first time in a while actually, it's me that's going to describe them. So in many ways, the 90s continued where the 80s left off. Independent cinema continued to thrive, and filmmakers like Kevin Smith, Richard Linklater and Jim Jarmusch had some of their biggest hits. In world cinema, many of the old masters were now gone, and there was a growth in new European cinema, and the rise of newer, more efficient technology meant that new voices could now afford to create films. Additionally, Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg started the Dogma 95 movement, specifically to make low-budget films without special effects to take back power for the directors as artists. In the UK, there was a mainstream resurgence with films like The Full Monty, Trainspotting and Brassed Off receiving widespread acclaim. This seemed to signal a departure from the more traditional stage view of British cinema. The 90s also saw Bollywood gain popularity worldwide, with Kuch Kuch Hota Hai being one of the top 10 movies in both the UK and India. The 90s was also the era of the blockbuster, with films like Jurassic Park, Independence Day, and the first film in the new Star Wars trilogy being released. We also saw huge advances in the technology behind animated films, and CGI films like Pixar's Toy Story proved a hit with audiences. Studios started to take note, and by the end of the decade, most had formed independent arms, such as Fox Searchlight. Studios like Miramax capitalized on these trends and made pictures that the Hollywood studio system may have previously turned down, with their biggest hit being Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, which won the Palme d'Or and was nominated for 8 Oscars on a budget of $8 million. In 1992, the term New Queer Cinema was termed by B. Ruby Rich of Sight and Sound magazine to describe the growing popularity of LGBTQ+ cinema. These films often sought to subvert assumptions about gender identity, sexuality, and class, and were often considered extremely radical, and include films like Cheryl Dunye's The Watermelon Woman and Greg Araki's The Living End. Ultimately, the 1990s saw the studio system forced into, admittedly briefly, making changes to its traditional way of working, and it saw the first black director nominated for an Oscar, it was John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, and saw a continuation from the 1980s of more representation of female figures in the industry. Penelope Spheeris' Wayne's World and Catherine Bigelow's Point Break being notable examples. And I think that takes us just about up to the 2000s. The first film we're going to discuss this week is Before Sunrise. So Before Sunrise starts on a train where Celine and Jesse are traveling through Europe. They get to talking and eventually decide to disembark the train and explore Vienna together. It's pretty much two people walking and talking and wanting to have sex with each other for the entire day. They kind of boast a little bit and self-indulge, but it's all, for me anyway, it's all about sort of when you're young and you're trying to impress. What did we all think of it on this watch? Chris?
I think it's quite almost like a meticulously put together film where like everything is quite sort of connected with everything else, and it's quite like tight. So when something doesn't quite work, it spreads through the whole film for me. And I find now Jesse to be quite annoying. And so there's a lot of stuff in the movie where like he does stuff that is either deliberately annoying. There are points where he's like meant to be sort of overreaching himself or like putting down ideas, which is because he has sort of certain internal issues. But I think that the way that that's treated it's kind of like, oh, he has these bad qualities, but they're almost like so annoying that you'd be like, I don't know if I want to have sex with you anymore. But having said that, I still think it's really quite enjoyable, because I think that even though at points he can be quite annoying, I think that Ethan Hawke is quite likable in this movie, and I think Julie Delpy is really likable in the film. And so even just spending the time with these two people is quite nice, because I think that they're quite charismatic actors that make you want to watch more of them.
Dawn?
Yeah, I think before I rewatched it, I had in my head that it was the one I liked the most of the trilogy, but then I think watching it, I realised maybe I liked Sunset more. So it's not to say it's a bad film, but yeah, I think as well it kind of annoyed me more than it maybe should have during and after watching it. I think the main thing for me was like, I don't know if I would have got off the train for him. Perhaps it's to do with this kind of greasy 90s look that gives him a slightly vibe at times. But also, I don't know if his chat was that convincing as to why she should get off. Also, I think kind of leads to this feeling I had watching it where I couldn't decide if it was going for realism or romanticism. I think what annoyed me was that it felt like it was going for realism, like with the kind of conversational style and the real time and the long unbroken shots, but it felt more like disguised romanticism disguised as realism. So I don't know why that annoyed me, but it did a bit.
Can I just jump in really quickly and say, I think that Steve Buscemi's character in Reservoir Dogs has a very similar sort of mustache and hair combo.
Kind of does, actually. I've never thought of it.
Yeah. Ethan Hawke is the jock Steve Buscemi. Oh yes, yeah. I've never thought about that. That's amazing.
Sorry, Don.
It does have moments where I do find it really charming, and it does capture that feeling that the characters are slightly naive to a lot of things and come across like they know everything at the same time, and that they are kind of more mature than they think they are, which is kind of what being young is maybe. So they're not just working out their feelings for each other, but they're still working out themselves as people. I like that aspect of it.
Kev?
I'm pretty much on board with what Don and Chris say. It's a really mood-dependent film, and I was quite interested because the first time I watched it round Joel's house, and he plied me with red wine, and he made me spaghetti bolognese and garlic bread. And the garlic bread was better than the film. It was amazing. I got the recipe off him. We had a lovely time. And we watched the trilogy. And so I had a really good memory of that evening, more than I had of the film. And I've since used it as a date movie a few times. And it's got this aphrodisiacal quality, because this naive idealism of the romance, you just inevitably, if you're in a romantic situation, you sort of crumble at the romance of the whole thing. And the movie seduces you if you're feeling romantic or if you're in a very good mood. Now, I watched it a few days ago. We've been in a lockdown for 4 months. I've had a holiday cancelled because of that. I was on my own, in my pants. It was a heat wave outside. I was really warm. And frankly, the last thing I wanted was to see two incredibly handsome people floating around Vienna, pawing at each other like dogs in heat. It was the least appealing prospect to me. And I sort of knew that going in, to be honest. But it means that Ethan Hawke's grating characteristics grate you a lot more when you're not in the mood for it. And the very self-important discussions, although you understand that maybe you would have these kind of discussions when you were a university undergraduate. I was a humanities student, so people were constantly talking like that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily want to spend the time with these people. And it's a film that's reliant on two characters that you want to be with for 90 minutes. And if you're not in the mood to be around them, then it's a tower of sand, basically. But there are a lot of positives to take from it, which is got a beautiful city symphony-like quality, even if that city symphony-like quality is more like a picture postcard from a tourist than a sort of in-depth discussion of the city itself. And the two performances are fantastic. Julie Delpy in particular, I think, just does a brilliant job of selling this idea that although I think she finds Ethan Hawke's character, a little grating at times, he does get a pass because he's a cute boy. which is sort of what a lot of people in their 20s do. They go, oh, they're a bit annoying, but I do fancy them. So, we'll go with this. And so you sort of appreciate that she does occasionally find it irritating, and that he is so precocious, but his excitability and the fact that he's a handsome boy with nice eyes gets him a pass a lot of the time.
Yeah, I tend to, it's interesting because last week when we were discussing My Dinner with Andre, Don brought up it's like the best possible lockdown film. And I kind of agree. I think Before Sunrise might be the worst possible lockdown film. When you're stuck inside, I'm not 100% sure, like you say, how much you want to see beautiful people exploring beautiful places when you can't do it yourself. But yeah, for me, the film means a lot to me from possibly the time in my life I watched it. I'm a big fan of Linklater anyway. And I do actually agree with you, Don, about this idea between kind of realism and romanticism, and it is kind of stuck somewhere in the middle there. If you can't jump into that with them, I think, yeah, I can totally see why it would be annoying, because I think the way it's shot is definitely romanticized. Like all these kind of dreamlike visuals, and there's almost like a haze over all of the colors. So it kind of is like a reminisce or a memory.
What I think about it, which I kind of want to hear Don's opinion on, is that it feels very my issues with Jesse they become bigger and they become more problematic for the film as a whole, because I think the film kind of plays through his lens and through this kind of male side of the story. And so when Jesse does stuff, it's supposed to be sort of it's almost like Linklater working through his own issues and working through the qualities of himself that he didn't like. And I feel like we don't really see, I feel like Julie Delpy is someone who has lots of traits, but they're almost seen through Jesse, rather than it's a film where she's as and I think the later films are a bit better than that kind of thing. But I don't know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, I kind of thought that as well a bit. I guess mainly with the bit on the train as well, because he's asking her to get off, and I think it would be a lot, it would be different if it was her trying to convince him to get off the train. Yeah, so I was kind of wondering if it was different for guys, and maybe they would kind of relate to his character a bit more and not see it as much of a problem, because obviously, most people, not just guys, would want to convince Julie Delpy to get off a train and walk around Venice with them.
I think it's important to say, as a bunch of quiet, retiring geeks who are making a film podcast, there's nothing particularly necessarily wrong with being overwhelmingly confident, and it isn't really a male fantasy or a female fantasy to say that confidence is appealing in another person. So maybe if you thought Ethan Hawke was attractive, and he's got a 90s style that's dated quite a lot, but he was deemed an attractive leading man, maybe you would get off the train with him.
Great.
If that kind of confidence was selling. But it is a fantasy, and it is the initial setup is a male-led fantasy.
Yeah, so let's summarize then. Why do we all really like or love Before Sunrise? Dawn?
Well, I do love the premise of it, and I guess most of the execution of that premise, I think it lets the content and the characters dictate the overall style, and that's something that makes it kind of timeless, even if it is very 90s. But yeah, if you think of some of the other kind of 90s romantic films at the time, everyone was going for the really intense MTV kind of style, which now just looks really lame. So it doesn't have that, so that's good. Yeah, and it is kind of unique in taking the kind of walk and talk with two characters in real time to such an extreme place. So that's interesting, and the acting is really great from both of them, even though I'm not really keen on Hawke's character. I think he does play it really well. He's just very good at playing that kind of character, really, especially in the 90s. It's just his character is pretty much in Reality Bites as well. They're quite similar in a way. Yeah, and I love the ending as well, with the shots kind of going around the places they've been. It kind of feels like a pretty good representation of memory, and how the character will kind of think back on the time they spent in those places, just as you will after you watch it. You'll kind of remember those places. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great film. and it has a certain idealism that will sit brilliantly with you if you're in a good mood, and not sit so brilliantly with you if you're not in a great mood. And it has a nostalgia for a certain romantic time in Richard Linklater's life that sort of harkens back to something like Woody Allen's Radio days, where the memory isn't accurate, but it is what's playing in your head, you know, which is what memory is. You know, we've all got relationships that we've had that seem a lot better now than they were at the time, definitely. Because if they were so great, they wouldn't have ended, you know. And you have to appreciate that. And I had to appreciate that when I was rewatching it and not particularly enjoying it and finding Ethan Hawke's character grating. But I think it captures this idea of these two characters who are not quite as intelligent as they think because they've got a youthful naivety. And that is something special. And it does sell this idea that these two characters have fallen in love incredibly quickly. And if you're in the right mood, you'll crumble at its romanticism. And if you're not, you wouldn't. But there's a lot to love in there.
Yeah, I pretty much completely agree with that, really. It's like, in some ways, it's like a romantic film about lust. You know, there's a lot of films, I think it's one of the films that captures that best. And they do share a connection, but I think for a lot of it, really, they want to sleep with each other more than anything. And, you know, that connection grows over the rest of the films, but I really think this one is about wanting to have sex with each other, basically. And yeah, I think for me, it's some of the best on-screen chemistry between two characters that there's been. And I think I really like that, like, dreamlike state of it that kind of feels like you say, like a hazy memory where you're, you know, remembering a youthful romance rather than experiencing it in that time. And I think that makes it it makes it better for me than it possibly would be if it didn't feel that way. Chris?
I'm very much one for viewing films not really as sort of objective things that just exist. I'm quite interested in kind of how you relate to them. And I think that this film, like all the problems that we've discussed that it has, I think are problems that I had in my worldview when I was a bit younger. Like all the kind of things about sort of focusing on this like male cockiness and things like that are things that I'd kind of dealt with earlier in my life. And I don't know whether, like, as we've said, I don't know whether the film really sort of is interested in that. It's just sort of like, oh, like, here's this fantasy. But I think that as someone coming to it, being aware of those issues, I think that it's really quite a charming way to look back on your past and go, I might have had these issues, but didn't I have a nice sort of view of love, and didn't I have a nice view of like the world, and wasn't it all like exciting at the time? And so it's like, even the things which I think are mildly problematic in it, I think take me back to a point in my life where I was like the characters in this movie. And so it feels quite real in that sense, even like sort of warts and all.
Okay, so the second film we're going to talk about is Lumiere and Company. Chris, do you want to describe this film? I was going to say do the plot of it, but that's quite difficult.
Yeah, it doesn't have a plot. So we haven't had any anthology films on this yet. And this is an anthology film of, basically the concept was, it was 1995. It was 100 years after the invention of the cinematograph. And they decided to give the original Lumiere brothers camera, the Lumiere brothers were the people who invented the camera, amongst others, to 41, which seems like a weird number. I feel like they probably gave it to 50 and then 9 people didn't do it. But to 41 different filmmakers. And they said, you've got to make a film. The original sort of film reels only lasted for 52 seconds and they had no editing in them. So they say, you got to do a film that's 52 seconds, no edits, using this camera.
I think that the problem for me is that a lot of the short films for me aren't great. And when you're talking about an anthology series, you're really talking about the strike rate of, it's like a sketch show. You know, you want more hits than misses, and this has way more misses for me. But there are some real corkers. I could pick out more than one of the films that I liked. So Arthur Penn does a really intriguing short film in which it starts with this guy who has bandages, and he seems to be clawing the bottom of a mattress, and then some stuff drips into his mouth, and then the camera pans up, and it seems to be either placenta or period blood or something. Not period blood, sorry, but some blood from a pregnant woman who is lying on the bed. And it's a really weird, haunting, inexplicable shot. David Lynch really goes head and shoulders above everyone else, which I actually think is a flaw in the film, is that his one is so good that everyone else looks incredibly amateurish and unimaginative. And as Chris said, the film itself, the in-between bits, are really self-important, really self-aggrandizing. Most of the directors don't come off particularly well or as particularly interesting people, really. Peter Greenaway, I hate him even more now that I've actually Peter Greenaway does that. This is my impression of Peter Greenaway. I enjoy playing with words and images, and it's the perfect arena for me. And then he wanders off as though he said something so amazing that is the most banal thing that you can possibly say about film, is that it has words and images in it. It's an atrocious thing to say. Having said that, his short film's quite good. But it's a very, very hit and miss film. But having it was worth a watch, and there's some interesting stuff. And I think if someone compacted the good bits into 50 minutes, you easily could, which is a flaw, but it is an interesting anthology. And most anthologies don't have as engaging a hook as Lumiere and Company.
So I think I, before watching this, misunderstood what kind of film it was going to be. So I went in with it with a bit of a different mindset and kind of had to adjust my mindset halfway through. I messaged Dawn and talking about, I thought it was going to be like The Five Obstructions, which is a von Trier film with Jürgen Leith, where they find ways to like limit. They remake a feature film. Was it called The Perfect Human?
Yeah.
With limits on how many frames per second they can have and things like that. So I think I thought it was maybe going to be kind of less of a sort of almost standard documentary style with those questions in between, and more, possibly like more experimental all through rather than just the shorts being experimental. And so I kind of had to adjust my mindset to what was ultimately a fairly standard documentary out with the films. And I think that possibly left me with a little bit of a feeling of disappointment. But that's, partially my own fault for going into it with those expectations. Yeah, I agree. I would like to cut out every single section that has those really boring questions that they're asking. I'm not interested in them at all, if I'm honest, because none of the answers were interesting.
The main problem was for me that there was so many filmmakers in such a short running time, in the documentary anyway, that it doesn't really give you a chance to digest each film before moving on to the next one. Like for me, the most interesting part of the project is the kind of planning of it and how the filmmakers approached that, and it doesn't really seem that interested in that other than these quite boring questions it keeps asking people. So yeah, I kind of just wish it took a bit more time to get into everyone's mindsets, maybe explore cinema a bit more, put a bit more kind of historical content in it, maybe with a bit of background. And I was also a bit disappointed at the kind of full diversity of it. Like at first it seems like a reasonable range of filmmakers from around the world, but when it comes to the interviews, it maybe felt like it highlighted more of the kind of older white men. Like there's only 3 women out of the 40, and I don't remember hearing any of their answers to the questions, or Spike Lee's even.
Can I cut in on that as well? Because I had a real problem with this. I've only just remembered that it was an issue for me, which is that all of the, predominantly the French directors, for whatever reason, get asked these questions, and then their answers are these sort of grand ideas about filmmaking, and any of the minority members of communities who get asked questions, it's usually they have to answer something about their community or about Chinese cinema or about African cinema, and they don't really get to just talk about cinema. And that's, I mean, again, that's a very 90s idea, and I doubt anyone was called up on that at the time. But it does show a certain almost colonialist idea of, well, the European cinema, they talk about cinema, but then we talk about world cinema, which is a whole other alien thing that isn't quite as good, but, you know, we'll give them a punt. And yeah, so that I also had many issues with that. Yeah.
Chris, is it directed by a French person?
Oh, the entire thing?
Yeah.
Oh, I have no idea. I don't care. I have no interest in like the overall thing. I like it because of the shorts. I have no interest in the business.
The only reason I ask, I mean, I wasn't just asking for no reason. The only reason I ask is because the French are like obsessed with Greenaway, and so I was wondering, because he gets quite a reasonable little focus, and I was wondering whether
I think he got
the screenplay is by Patrice Leconte, who is a French film director.
I think he also got like a bit of screen time because he was doing a big art exhibition at the time, and you can see it in the background of his shots. And I think they just went, oh, he's doing an exhibition about film. Let's like shoot him in front of it, so we have exciting like backings to like his interview.
It does make him look bizarre, like he's in some underwater cavern.
Yeah, he feels very Bond villain.
Like that's his home.
I find the concept very interesting, and I find the films that are made by the filmmakers very interesting. I think that the person who made it somehow managed, like Patrice, whatever I've just said. I think they're a bit of an idiot. Because I think that the actual bits between but I think the thing is that the concept really sets up for all these filmmakers to do really interesting things, and then it's almost as though like Patrice Leconte goes, oh, and also I'm interesting too. I really love the Spike Lee one because a lot of the very early films were kind of like these home movies where people filmed their little babies, but they were all white French people. And so I think that Spike Lee's movie is supposed to be a commentary on the fact that, like, because he has this kid dressed up in this way, which is supposed to look kind of like, I don't know, like late 1800s. I was going to say Victorian, but I mean, like, all these people were French, so they probably didn't hear about that. But he's dressed up like that. And it's almost like saying this, like he's confronting you with saying this is what was missing in these films at the time. Like people like my child would exist then. I actually am a big fan of the ones which go into a more story direction, because I think that they almost like miss the possibilities of very early cinema before storytelling.
This is an interesting point, because for me, I probably would have liked to see Georges Méliès and Company, the film, where there's a sort of ingenuity, because Lumiere and Company, the idea is that the camera is an ingenious invention, and so the camera is the impressive idea. Whereas I think that effectively photography was doing the same thing as the films that you're highlighting. I'm going to do a big version of this, but I'm going to invite 41 filmmakers to make a TikTok video.
That would be today's version.
And I bet none of them would sign on. None of them would sign on, and that is just as interesting an idea as this.
I think it's interesting to me, Chris, that you're talking about like being able to get into the mindset of these filmmakers, because I tend to agree a little bit more with Don that I probably would have liked to have been able to see more into the mindset of the filmmakers. So I guess I probably would have liked, I don't know, maybe, what is it? It's about an hour and a half. So maybe if it had focused on maybe 4 or 5 of the filmmakers and we'd seen how they deal with the camera, how they approach the restrictions of the camera and how they approach filming with it, could have got rid of all of the questions and just really focused in on like 4 or 5 diverse filmmakers who make very different kinds of films.
I think it's some of the films are interesting. It's an interesting premise that fluffs it.
I tell you my favorite.
Yeah.
It was maybe one of the simplest ones, and it was I think Michael Haneke's one that's just off the TV screen.
That one's, yeah.
Because I think he finds a really interesting way to sum up the evolution of images in a more realistic Hanukkah-esque way that is dealing with the violence and the news, whereas a lot of other ones just have like, you know, people dancing and then it turns to a camera and then film and then that's it. You don't look inside that.
Yeah,
You
I
opened up
agree with
that
you.
box.
Anika's one was really good, actually. Don, do you have any fun facts on this?
The voice that you hear in the Kurosami one is Isabelle Huppert. Yeah.
Okay, so let's sum up what we all think of Lumiere and Company. Let's start with Kev.
I mean, as I've said, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I understand a bit more after this discussion why Chris chose it. For me, the non-fiction aspect of silent cinema in the 1890s is not overly interesting to me. I feel like if I was totally brutal about what I think of 1890s cinema in terms of the documentary, it feels like watching a tech demo. It feels like this is what you could do, and now someone's going to do something more interesting about it, like George Méliès pops into view in history. But I appreciate entirely that the more documentary, plonk a camera down aspect of it is interesting to some people, not to me. For me, the more experimental films that were breaking the technology or trying to do something new with it and kind of really pushing the limits of it are what intrigued me. And there wasn't enough of that for me. Also, as a documentary, it fails. So there's some fantastic stuff in there. It's worth watching. Probably the shorts are all on YouTube. You could probably pick and choose the ones you like. However, what I would say is that when I'm watching these compilations, especially ones that are as short form as this, I tend to view them as more as a sort of catalogue of filmmakers who I've not heard of, and I write down those filmmakers. And for the same reason, I wouldn't put the Argos catalogue in the 100 greatest books of all time. I wouldn't really put this in the greatest films of the 90s. It's a reference guide to me. But there's some great shorts in there, and I appreciate why people like it.
Don?
Yeah, again, I think there are some interesting films and points of view amongst it all. I guess everyone will be able to take away something different from it based on whatever they think is an interesting way to approach that challenge. And yeah, I think I like the idea of kind of limiting yourself creatively, to see how that makes you think differently and focusing on an idea fully. So yeah, maybe you could take some inspiration from that if you thought, oh, maybe I'll give this a go. So yeah, it's an interesting experiment, but just watch the films and not the documentary, which somehow gives a more limited viewpoint than actually expanding on the films.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, pretty much what Kevin and Don have said. I think there's some really interesting films there. There'll be a few that I'll go back and watch, a few filmmakers also that I hadn't heard of, and that's, you know, a big positive because I can go and check out the other films that they've made. I think, yeah, as a documentary, I don't think it really works because I don't think there's enough of a focus there on actually uncovering a story or telling the sort of how these films were made. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I guess I would have just liked it to be a little bit more focused. Chris?
David Lynch thinks, oh, I want to make like a story like I would in modern film, but using this old technology. Somebody else thinks, oh, try and like show how the racism of like the like original sort of 1890s like era of cinema. And someone else goes, oh, I just want to show like this egg being cooked because that's really interesting. And it's like an interesting thing that like you wouldn't have filmed with this camera at the time. And it's just like lots of different things that make you go, oh, why did they do that? What do they think about the world? And they're all capturing their own 50-second chunk of it that I find really fascinating and inspiring.
Okay, so the third film we're going to talk about is Beau Travail. Kev, do you want to do the...
Beau Travail! And tell my opinion of it. Beau Travail is directed by one of the greatest living filmmakers, in my opinion, Claire Denis. It is loosely an adaptation of the Herman Melville story, Billy Budd, and it's about a bunch of lads in the French Foreign Legion, and as they go and train and work on their physique and go on army manoeuvres. They have a crippling repression and a sort of longing for sexual contact that is never spoken. At night, they go out to this town that's nearby where their camp is, and they try and flirt with women, and nothing really happens. As this kind of familial / sexual undercurrent is going on, there is one high-up general who is bitter about a younger member of the Foreign Legion. He may be in love with him, he may fancy him, but he definitely has this resentment that turns into him tormenting this younger general.
So for me, I took a lot more from it this time, and I kind of thought about it for a few days afterwards, actually. I think it's a astoundingly choreographed film, because I mean it's very much a choreographed film. Like, I know all films are blocked, but this is properly, like, you can tell it's choreographed to an absolute T, because it's, in many ways a ballet. Like, there's so many sequences, and it kind of reminded me of a strange, like, this is just but like somewhere between like the tragedy and the ballet of Red Shoes with Walkabout. Like, and if you kind of mash them together, you might sort of have this film. But I thought, like, performatively, it was really beautiful as well. Like, it's kind of quite, like, in a lot of ways, it's quite subtle in the things it's pointing out, and some of the sort of, because I mean, really, it's limited in dialogue. A lot of it's kind of narrated, and I think that quite often that can take away from the strength, but in this one, I think it adds to the strength.
Yeah, I've been meaning to watch this one for a while, I think, along with most other Claire Denis films, because I think I've only seen the most recent one she did, High Life. So yeah, I didn't really know what to expect with this one. So it was a lot more visual than I thought it was going to be, but in a good way. Yeah, it's not really about the kind of dialogue or the plot, but about the feeling that you get from watching it. So I think the more I got into it, the more I became aware that the landscape is such an important part of the film, and it perfectly reflects the rigidity of the characters. Like, everything around them is so harsh and dry, and lines and angles, and nothing grows there. Like, so even though little is said, you kind of understand the repression that these characters are feeling through that. And yeah, there is also this mesmerizing use of repetition, like you're talking about, the choreography of it, and how that shows the conformity, and how it's sucking the life out of them. They want to be free. Yeah, so I felt like I got something out of it on a first watch, but I think afterwards I felt like there's a lot I still missed that I could go back to and get more out of it another time, because it is quite ambiguous a lot of the time, and I thought maybe I'd just missed something, but I think, yeah, it's...
I mean, for me, I think Claire Denis, the strength of her lies in her ambiguity. I think if you're relying on visuals as much as Beau Travail is, then you're allowing for interpretation, which is why I enjoy it so much. And I think that more than sort of certain other films that we've discussed, I mean, I love interpreting Blue Velvet, as we discussed, and The Falls in the last episode, Chris loves interpreting. I feel like when you reinterpret Beau Travail, you actually enrich your life in a way that you take that out into the world, which is quite strange. So I'll let Chris speak before I go on more. Sorry.
I mean, I don't want to be a huge downer, to be honest, but
And don't be.
I feel like sometimes I feel like I can see films as something that people would think of as a good film, and I go, that's what someone would think of as a good film. But I got very, very little out of it myself personally. Largely due to my issue with, I think that I'm not interested in what the experience of the main character. I feel like a lot of the film is using the like, it's trying to say, like, these are the, like, difficulties that like colonialism puts onto the colonizer. Like being in the army puts these limitations onto this person. But a lot of it ends up feeling very like it's this guy who's going through his own kind of psychological problems where it's like the country is used as a backdrop to his own inner issues. Whenever you go to the town and you meet the women who live in the town, I sort of perked up and I was like, "Ooh, what are they going to do?" And then it's like, let's go back to the camp to deal with like this white guy's issues. And I'm like, oh, I just don't care. Like, and I feel like the film is trying to critique the colonial mindset, but I'm just personally, I'm like not very interested in that. And so I found myself wanting to see different aspects of the world which were created through it.
Well, it raises an interesting point because this idea of the colonised, I think that Claire Denis has a really unique eye, and it's an eye that actually no other director has, which is that she was born in Cameroon, I believe, during French occupation, during French colonialism. And there's a lot of her films, pretty much the majority of her films, are about people who are technically outsiders, but they believe themselves to be insiders, but no way will they ever be accepted as insiders in the community. And it's when the colonialist begins to have a certain relationship with the country that it's in, which Claire Denis grew up and had that mentality, and so believed herself to be from Cameroon. Everyone spoke French. She believed that, you know, she was a part of that society, and then would be very alienated by both the racism from the colonial people, but also would be alienated from the people who she sympathised with. And so I think that although you can say, and fair play if you don't want to watch a film about a coloniser, because it's a touchy subject, but I think that saying that the implication is that a coloniser's viewpoint is invalid and we shouldn't make any effort to understand it seems quite intellectually lazy to me, to be honest.
I guess I wasn't really looking at it just from that perspective. I think I was more interested in the kind of masculinity side of it and the kind of homosexual repression of that in the army. I think can be interesting enough without having to just look at it in the colonial perspective.
I think there's a lot of layers to it as well, because I think there's a real existential idea going on about the whole film, which is partly linked to colonial ideas, but it's this idea of this group of guys who have a sort of monastic lifestyle, and they live in this wasteland, and they go on army manoeuvres, and they do all these things, but then they go to the town and they just live like normal people whenever they get to the town. But when they get back, they treat everything seriously. But ultimately, it reduces these military manoeuvres and this routine, it reduces it to a game or to a dance, or it says that these people have this astonishing dignity and astonishing physique, but it ultimately amounts to nothing. When they get back to France, if you're in the Foreign Legion, you are no one when you get there. You're probably a criminal, or you've probably done something bad and you're escaping. And you get there and you basically kill time for 10 years, especially if there's not a military situation. And then you get a French passport and you go to a place where nobody knows your name and nobody knows you. So you're an outsider at the start because you've escaped from something. And then you're an outsider when you're in the French Foreign Legion because you're a colonist. And then you're an outsider when you get to Paris. So ultimately, it all amounts to nothing. And I think there's something much grander as an existential philosophy going on than just here's the colonial mindset. And I actually think the colonial mindset doesn't actually amount to a huge theme for me in the film. There's a lot more going on.
Can we discuss kind of briefly the ending of the film and what we took from it? Because it's quite a well, I guess whatever way you look at it, it's a thinker of an ending, whichever way you take it. So just because I'm really interested in that, because I found it a really fascinating ending to that story. I'll go to Chris or Don because Kev just spoke.
Don can go first because I spoke quite a lot.
Yeah, I guess it could be like a kind of dream or heaven where he just gets to be himself and have a nice time and just let loose. Yeah, so it's a nice nice feeling to end it on. It kind of comes out of nowhere and kind of magical and genius.
Great
Yeah.
dancing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's like this form of like kind of this one true escape, right, from like this blocked off militaristic lifestyle. And even though the whole film is choreographed, like it's interesting to me because although that is probably the most choreographed routine in the entire film, it feels the loosest. It feels the kind of in some ways like the bravest. Like there's all these kind of wild arm flails and all these kind of interesting kind of leg movements, almost like break dancing in a way. And it's like kind of the one time where the shackles of like rigidity are blown off, and it's after the tragedy of the kind of actual ending of the film. And yeah, I found that really interesting, and that kind of left me thinking about it for a couple of days afterwards.
We should probably describe the scene if anyone's not seen it. So it opens, we have Denis Lavaugh's character, who's been sort of the evil guy. He gets to France eventually. He's left the French Foreign Legion. He makes his bed in this dignified manner. And we've been told before that even the creases of these French Foreign Legion soldiers have a dignity about them. And you see that this dignity is actually means very little, because he's made his bed and he lives alone and he's got no one. And he lies down on the bed and he holds a gun over his chest. And then Claire Denis does this amazing thing, which he just tracks the camera up to the pulse in his arm and focuses on that as he's flexing these muscles that amount to nothing. And then we cut to, we can only assume he's killed himself. And we cut to him in the same nightclub that he was going to when he was in the French Foreign Legion. And you never see him dancing amazingly before this. And Rhythm of the Night comes on. This is the rhythm of the night, oh night. Does that, it's amazing. You feel elated, you feel magical. And he feels elated and he feels magical. And finally he can escape. And he does this mad dance that is totally off the hook.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating walk.
You got any fun facts, Don?
Ooh.
I'm forgetting every time the fun facts.
How could you? So the dance scene was shot in a single take at the end. And apparently this was the film that inspired Greta Gerwig to be a director.
It just feels to me like a very it feels like a film which would be accepted by people because it doesn't really challenge a lot of the stuff that I want it to. Maybe that's me coming from a very specific perspective and expecting it to do something that it isn't interested in doing. But to me, I would rather watch a film about the people who live there, or watch a Derek Jarman film, which is more explicitly and more sort of in your face about like the queer elements of it.
Yeah, so for me, the restraint of the film is its strength. I think I find it kind of hypnotizing, and I really like films where I'm like drawn in and you're not given everything on a plate. You kind of have to develop your own viewpoint on it and work it out. I think it's really beautiful to look at, and maybe even if you don't necessarily take anything from the plot, I think aesthetically you'll still take something from it. Like we talked about a little bit, it could almost work as a silent film. It feels a bit like a ballet, and the ending is really fantastic, and you'll probably find yourself pondering it for days, or maybe you won't. Don?
Well, yeah, it's such a beautiful looking film, and it has a really unique approach to exploring its characters and the way they kind of move around the space, like the dance we were talking about. And it's got a really interesting soundtrack as well. And I did have Rhythm of the Night stuck in my head for ages afterwards. And it does kind of make you want to dance about and be free. And ultimately, the film is kind of going for this feeling, or the desire for this feeling. Yeah, Denise Lavaughn is intensely stunning as always, and such a babe.
Okay.
I think it's great. I think it can be quiet and meditative, and it can also be very visually compelling at the same time. I think that its restraint, which Chris has a problem with, I think for me is one of its strengths. I mean, if I can talk personally for a second, this has only just occurred to me, which is that I'm a bi-curious or bisexual man, and I didn't really notice that until I was in my late 20s. And that element of me was unexplored, and it was possibly just laying dormant at one point. And if you're not aware of your own sexuality all the time, which not everyone is, then you are going to be kind of restrained and repressed in a way that I think that film shows in quite an adept way, personally.
Okay, so the fourth film this week is Reservoir Dogs. Don, do you want to?
Of course, pow. So it's about 6 criminals who don't know each other, and they've been hired to carry out a diamond robbery by this crime boss called Joe Cabot and his son, nice guy Eddie. And we see them preparing for the robbery, and they're all given code names that are colours to kind of hide their identities from each other. And the robbery itself, which we don't actually see, is a complete disaster, and the cops show up almost immediately after the robbery has taken place. And the chase ensues that ends up with some police and members of the group and civilians all getting killed. And so the remaining members of the group gradually make it back to the rendezvous in a warehouse, and they begin to suspect that one of them might be an undercover cop. And then it's happy, and then it's sad, and then it's the end.
Is it happy? Then it's sad.
I think it can be happy.
I suppose, yeah.
There are happy bits.
But the lion in the coconut, you drag the bowl up. That's happy. Brilliant.
But did we all rewatch this very recently then? Yeah. Okay, so what did we take from it this time, Kev?
Yeah, well, every time I watch any Tarantino film, I always expect to dislike it, even if I've rewatched it thousands of times and loved it, which I do with Reservoir Dogs. And I think it's because at the moment he's very out of fashion. He's incredibly out of step with the times. And so you tend to keep reassessing his work in your head because he gets so many negative headlines, which, you know, maybe he's quoting, maybe not. That's a debate for another time, I imagine. But Reservoir Dogs, as a first film, it is possibly the most confident first film you'll ever see. It's incredibly filled with this incredible bravado. And it proves that despite Tarantino's sort of sprawling epics, that maybe need a better editor. He can really work within a set of limitations brilliantly well. And the dialogue that some may criticise as being overcooked in other films works really well here because he's working within a very low budget. It's a lot of fun, and the dialogue's great, and some of it can make you wince a bit. I still don't know how I feel about Quentin Tarantino's use of racial epithets in this film. But I think it's an astonishingly strong piece of genre work.
Chris?
I don't know what I think about it. It was a sort of difficult one to come back to because I remembered it in a kind of different way than I saw it now, which I think I remembered it as being quite a sort of cool movie that maybe lacked a bit of depth. And now coming back to it, I think I've almost like 180'd my position, where I'm like, I think that the attempts that it makes at being quite cool are at some points very, they're very Tarantino in a way that the older I get, the less I like. A lot of the kind of discussions about media I find very sort of teenage. But the acting in this film is really quite amazing. I think that all the guys in it are really great, except for Tarantino himself, who is in far too much of this movie and should not be in it at all. And actually put me in a...
He wanted to play Mr. Pink originally.
Yeah. Oh, God. He put me in a bad mood to begin with, just how much he is in the first scene. I was like, oh, God. But I think that it's a very, I think, at points... I think my issue is that I think it doesn't really settle on what it wants to be. And at points, it's trying to be this kind of like quirky, cool movie taken off of like people like Godard, who like early Godard, where he's like making loads of pop culture references and like playing like inappropriate music in certain scenes and having like a wacky fun time. And then this slightly more gritty, more grounded portrait of all the characters.
It's an astonishingly well made for a first-time director, really. Unbelievably, confident and kind of the non-linear thing, which a lot of first-time directors try and fail with. He tries and succeeds incredibly well with, which, yeah, and I mean, it's obviously been ripped off multiple times. And I think, yeah, there are some issues like Kev talked about, the use of racial slurs, the use of gender slurs, which I'm not super keen with. But I think overall, the kind of performances, the kind of pretty much one set in one room. The apartment was just above the set, so they make an absolute asset of what was a really low budget, really.
Yeah, well, it's one of my faves. It kind of has been ever since I watched it. So I guess I was trying to think of the best way to describe all the ways in which I like it and how that's kind of evolved over the years. So I think there's like 4 layers of enjoyment for me. So there's the first, the kind of surface cool layer with all the kind of stylish things and the soundtrack and the kind of memorable snappy dialogue and the violence even as well and the references. So you can't really ignore that aspect when talking about the film, I guess. And then this second layer is like the nostalgic layer. It's quite small, but it's still there because I watched it for the first time on my 18th birthday. And so it's probably shaped a lot of the ways in which I've viewed it over the years, because I think Tarantino films in general appeal to that kind of younger mindset, like when you're just getting into films, and it's nice to revisit it and see how your opinion changes on that. And I guess it's also partly responsible for introducing me to my 2 boys, Tim and Steve. And they took me on many cinematic adventures that maybe I wouldn't have had if I hadn't watched this film when I did. And then the third layer is like the cinematic layer, because I saw it in the cinema last year. And I think that's another kind of part of fully enjoying and appreciating the film, is to watch it in an environment with an audience. I think as well, like Tarantino has a great awareness of the psychology of an audience and how to manipulate that and create something that's bold and visceral and entertaining. And then the fourth layer is the kind of depth and everything else going on underneath that, which maybe I've only recently kind of realized. And like it kind of made me think more about the way we were thinking about Taxi Driver, and that it kind of attracts you and repels you at the same time. Like, so you have these criminals, some of which are sociopaths or psychopaths, and you get to know them through the banter and the situations you don't usually associate with criminals preparing for a heist. But then there's like a lot of human moments in there as well. I think my favorite is kind of Mr. White comforting Mr. Orange and combing his hair, and the beautiful bromance of it. And it's also very funny as well, and you're kind of drawn to these characters, and you might even find some of them quite likable. But then the film uses the violence and the offensiveness of the language to make you feel uncomfortable and to provoke you.
It feels like a film to me that I think has been a little bit ruined with time, with who Tarantino became later. There's a lot of stuff which I think like you've all picked up on, which is really interesting in it. But then the more you hear him talk, the more you go, I don't know if that was on purpose.
Well, you do. I mean, it opens up a wider discussion that maybe Tarantino's the perfect vehicle for, which is how much should you really be attaching the director to his work? I mean, we don't really do that with authors a lot of the time. You know, we've got Roland Barthes talking about the death of the author. How much does it matter that Tarantino's turned into this sort of celebrity provocateur? Does that matter?
Well, I'm also, on that kind of note, I'm really interested in the fact that originally he was going to make Reservoir Dogs just with his mates, you know, like you would, like a lot of us do with, our films. and then was it Harvey Keitel read the script and wanted to produce it and starred in it. So like part of me wonders how much of that kind of the fact that the film works is as a result of those kind of actors coming in.
I think a lot of the subtleties in like the personalities and like the sort of darker sides and the lighter sides of the characters, I think come from the performances rather than the script.
But then again, yeah, I mean, the question is that how much of that is down to the direction and how much of that is down to the actors, because obviously the director is directing the actors in which way to go. So
yeah, it's an interesting thing because it does feel like, and I would be like, this isn't a criticism, Chris, because I feel like I'd be really tempted to do this as well because I don't like Tarantino as a figure. But I think it's really tempted to go say, well, every other film we've discussed, we've basically had an auteur-led idea that the director did this. But because it's Tarantino, we'll say, no, he's not really got much to do with it. But I actually think, maybe this is too much of a tangent, but I think that Jackie Brown is a very mature work.
So do I, yeah.
And I actually think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, although flawed, is a very mature work. And I think he has it in him.
Oh, I thought it was rubbish.
No, a lot of people did, yeah. I seem to be in a minority in really liking that film. But I think that he has an ability to discuss adult themes, and he has an ability to create multi-dimensional characters. Maybe he was in the 2000s pandering to a specific idea of him overly, but I'm not sure if that impacts the quality of Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily does. I think it's kind of difficult, like Chris talks about, it's kind of difficult now not to look at his work afterwards and kind of make comparisons. But I do think, like, yeah, Reservoir Dogs kind of stands alone. It's a little bit different to some of his other work. And like you talked about earlier, Kev, I think Tarantino's often at his best, or seems to be at his best, when he's maybe a bit more constrained by either budgetary or kind of location restrictions and stuff like that.
You got any fun facts, Don?
Oh yeah, I've got a great one. So though there's no definitive answer to what Mr. White whispers to Mr. Orange, in the French release of the film he says, "You don't want a blowjob, by the way." In the Italian dub version he says, "Do you want me to give you a hand job too?" And in the Spanish dub version he says, "I'll comb your hair so you look handsome."
Oh. Okay, let's summarize then. Go with Chris first.
My kind of feeling about this film is that it feels like a very important film for how the 90s developed and how sort of crime films developed. And I think that it led a lot of people, less so myself, but a lot of people into film by going, oh, wow, there's all these things going on. There's all these great actors. Like maybe a film could be more than just like an action movie or something like that, because there are like these themes in it. But for me personally, it's very much in that way where it's a gateway to other stuff. I look back on it and I think of it as something that is slightly lacking, because it took me to things I'm more interested in. And so I look back on it and I go, it's very good at doing that thing, but I probably wouldn't watch it I wouldn't have watched it if it hadn't been suggested.
For me, it's probably, like I say, that and Jackie Brown are Tarantino's kind of sharpest dialogue. Performance-wise, I think it's really great, and also really well cast. There's kind of not anyone out of place bar Tarantino himself. Yeah, I love this kind of like, you know, pretty much one location dynamic that he goes for. I'd really have loved to have seen him do that maybe a little bit more in further films, although maybe that would have just got tedious, I don't know. But yeah, I think that the way he directs the actors in Reservoir Dogs, the performance style, the way that the kind of non-linear narrative plays out is quite an incredible directorial debut. Yeah, I think it holds up pretty damn well, barring the sort of issues that we've already talked about. I think it, as a film, holds up really well, and kind of in a lot of ways feels quite modern in a way that some 90s films don't. So yeah, Kev?
It's sleek, it's stylish, Soundtrack's great. The acting's great. Script is dynamite. It is. I mean, yeah, it is a teenage film, and as I said, I watched it at the age of 11. So it'll always have a place for me where it irrevocably shook me and disturbed me horribly because I was far too young for that kind of material. And so it holds a certain place for me that very few films do. Clockwork Orange I saw at the same age as well, and that really fucked me up. So I do have a certain nostalgia for it, but I think it transcends nostalgia. I think if you're a teenager, you'll get a lot more out of it because the cool things that Tarantino likes will be a lot more tolerable to you because he has that kind of mentality, a sort of impish quality that likes to sort of magpie different pieces of cultural paraphernalia and stick them together. But I'm 30. I still had a right laugh when I watched it. I found it funny. I found it horrible. I thought the ending was absolutely amazing. And I had a right laugh when Put the Line in the Coconut comes on at the end. And I went, it doesn't work at all. That's brilliant. Brilliant fun. I had a lot of fun.
Dawn?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's absolutely perfect. I think it's kind of close enough for me. Like every time I watch it, it still feels like such a bold and exciting and surprising film, even though I know what's going to happen next. Perhaps it's because of the structure, is even though I kind of remember what happens, I don't always necessarily remember the exact order of everything and how it kind of intersects. Yeah, and it has evolved with me as I've got older and I've got different things from it. Great debut, like we were talking about, and represents a great time in independent cinema before it all got Miramaxed and they just threw too much money at people, including Tarantino. And also the Commode story is just one of my favorite things ever. And you can look at that as kind of a symbol of the film, and that Tarantino takes the essentials of the genres and the styles he's imitating and then makes the rest his own.
Okay, so the final film of the day is A Moment of Innocence. Who wants to do the plot summary of this one? Should we all
You should go.
You can do it if you want.
All right, go for it.
Prepared.
Go for it.
So it's factual, fictional reconstruction documentary of sorts about the director's own experiences. When he was 17, he wounded a policeman after stabbing him at a protest rally in an attempt to take his gun. And so 20 years later, after serving time in prison, he's tracked down the policeman and proposes for them to both reconstruct their version of the events using actors. And they both get to choose who plays their younger selves. And the rest of the film documents and explores the process of reconstructing their past and many other things.
This was a very recent watch for all of us, wasn't it? For the first time, I mean. So what did you think of it, Kev?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't something I was particularly aware of. I have to say, Iranian film isn't really something I'm knowledgeable about at all. So a totally unqualified opinion here, because it does deal with the Iranian Revolution, and it is very much within its own milieu, quite clearly. So there's clearly some symbolic elements that I'm not aware of in the film, and I could see they were there, but I haven't figured them out. But what I found interesting, the more universal general themes, are this idea that you've got this policeman who's sort of vain, but it's more of an attempt to reclaim his life rather than an outright egotistic exercise. And he wants the young actor playing him, to be handsome and to be the hero of something. And then you've got the documentary maker or filmmaker who also wants to be the hero. And therein you have the problem of the Iranian Revolution partly, which is you have two opposing forces who both believe they're right, pushing against each other. And at the time in Iran, you have a time of peace, relatively. A lot more restrictions, but a lot less chaos. And you've got these two violent forces who are trying to force the younger generation into mimicking them. And that's really compelling to watch. And the breakdown that some of the young people have at being forced into this situation is a bit heartbreaking. Unfortunately, I watched it at 6:30 in the morning, so I couldn't really empathise with it like that. But I did later on when I thought about it. I thought it was quite upsetting. But yeah, it has enough universal themes to be discussing a very specific topic, which is the Iranian Revolution. But you can still take something from it as a general viewer, and it makes you want to read up on the Iranian Revolution to appreciate some of the more obscure symbolism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I thought like it's interesting that every week somehow we end up with like a sort of a selection of films that represent a sort of overarching theme. And this week it seems to be kind of memory as a sort of theme.
Yeah.
Before Sunrise and Beau Travail and Moment of Innocence are all films
And
about,
Lumiere.
and Lumiere are all films about memory. Reservoir Dogs maybe less so, but
we remembered the film though.
Yeah.
Our memories of the film.
It's a memorable film. And that's interesting to me because they all deal with it in a very, very different way. And like Moment of Innocence it captures that kind of, it's actually very funny at times. There's some really humorous stuff in there when it's dealing with an incredibly dark subject matter actually. And yeah, I found some of the sections very heartbreaking. Dawn had actually given me a bit of a sort of almost like a warning that because you'd said to me like, oh, you were in tears at the and I don't know, I found myself because I've actually watched it twice now. I watched it once slightly before, and then I watched it again to prepare for this, and second time round found it more heartbreaking. The first time round I hadn't expected it to be funny at all, just because of the subject matter, I guess. I hadn't kind of anticipated the sort of the humor in it, and there's quite a bit, especially at the start. But yeah, I thought it was performed really well, and yeah, the kind of the contrast between young and old, between like old memories and new memories, and between trying to, in some ways, make amends for something that's happened in the past, but in other ways trying to tell a story. I found that really fascinating.
I've seen a couple of Iranian films which are very sort of metatextual, like they're very interested in the filmmaking process. Close Up is the big one, obviously, but I also saw a film called Taxi Tehran, which does a sort of similar thing. And I think this is probably my favorite out of them all due to there is this, I don't know how wide this is because again, I'm not like a big expert on Iranian cinema, but there is like this very realist bent to a lot of them. Which doesn't quite sit with me just in my personal tastes. But I think that this one, because of its playfulness and because of its like sort of different levels of reality, where it's almost like some of the scenes with the younger characters are almost like flashbacks in a sense, because they are completely redoing the actions of the original people, but it's almost like flashbacks where you're reinterpreting them with a newer worldview. So sometimes they play out exactly the same, sometimes they play out with like a little bit of a change, like especially like the conclusion of the film. So I think, yeah, the sort of playfulness of levels of reality I find very interesting. I think with what Kev was saying a little bit, I agree with without the context of the historical situation, there are some elements that I can't quite connect with. Like I think it's a good message to be like this kind of anti-violence sort of moving on, sort of patching things up. But then I'm like, because I don't know what the situation in the revolution is, I don't know whether that's like a positive outlook or quite a conservative outlook. Like I'm not sure like what's really going on there because I don't really know what's happening. But as a more general message about sort of reconciliation, I think that it's very interesting, especially like sort of younger people who don't want to be drawn into the battles of like none of them are actually their parents, but they're like the age of their parents, and they're kind of like trying to mold them in their own image, so they kind of act like parental mentors to them.
Yeah.
So I found it quite moving, but also I think I found it very funny. There's a lot of like piercing of the two sort of older guys, the filmmaker and the policeman. There's a lot of stuff in there which is deliberately poking fun at, like, obviously they have reasons for their beliefs and it doesn't parody them, but it does poke fun at like how obsessive they are about certain things, and I found that very funny.
Yeah, I guess I'm really into films that do kind of blur the lines between fact and fiction. Like anytime I read that in a description of a film, I'm right in there. And a lot of the time I'm kind of disappointed. But occasionally I find a film that does it really well, like this one, and along with some of the other Iranian new wave films like we were talking about. And the director, Mahmoud's daughter, he also did, or he wrote the script for one that she directed when she was 17, called The Apple, which also does something similar, kind of recreating a real life story. So yeah, I think I find this idea of what the truth is really interesting, because it is so hard to capture, especially in documentary, because they are just as constructed as fictional films most of the time, and are edited and condense events and create stories and manipulate the truth. So I think in a way the best way to explore the truth is to acknowledge the role that fiction has in it, to use it to create a greater truth. Similar to what we were talking about with Working Girls last time, I guess, that it uses real stories, but in a fictional setting, to kind of fully explore a subject, because it knows the limitations of documentary. And they would be able to do the same thing in that.
Do you think that from an editorial perspective, you can look at that as quite interesting as well? Because it's that kind of idea that, you know, from an editor, you're constantly seeking out these moments of truth, I suppose, and then you've got these films. So I wonder if, like, Don's an editor, by the way, for anyone watching. I wonder if, like, looking at these films from an editorial perspective, they maybe speak to you more, because that's kind of part of what being an editor is, you know?
Yeah, I think I found I was kind of questioning every scene in it as to whether it was documentary or a fiction, or kind of made to look like a documentary. And I think it's an awareness that kind of you always need to have, especially in times of fake news.
Yeah.
So it kind of made me think about that, I guess.
It has an awareness as well that we all have our own narrative, and the policeman in his head is the hero, and the director in his head is the hero.
Yeah.
And the policeman is sort of poked fun of a little more. He's a faintly ridiculous figure at times. But ultimately, this idea that we all have our own narrative, and that being able to find the middle ground of our own narrative, is something that we don't really acknowledge at the moment in the popular sphere. Everyone has their narrative and shouts it at each other a lot, which maybe is necessary in some cases, but is generally not a particularly great way to conduct a society. And I think that it takes a great deal of skill from Mohsen Makhmalbaf is the name of the director, and it's incredibly well played by him, because it's a very empathic film. Because obviously this did happen to him, and he probably did hate the police officer during the Iranian Revolution. They were the enemy. You know, this was an uprising. And he manages to convey all the flaws of the police officer and all of the actually very pleasant, very nice attributes of the police officer. And the idea that this police officer was holding on to a love that was actually a total con job by the director, created by the director himself, is quite a profoundly upsetting idea, that you would live your life for 20 years with this lie that you're being told. And at the same time, the director is constructing a lie for you, the viewer, to consume.
Yeah.
So everything keeps folding in on itself in this film. It's amazing. The ending, I mean, it's quite famous from what I've read of it for its final shot, which freeze frames. And it's not a definitive ending necessarily. It leaves a lot open for interpretation, because he potentially does still get stabbed.
Yeah.
But the police officer is the one who has corrected his behaviour. So you could view that as a pro-establishment viewpoint potentially if you were looking at policemen as sort of a symbol for the establishment on the whole. I'm not sure if it does. I think instead it looks at the policeman as an individual, and I think that what the film is really trying to do in a lot of ways is saying, look at the two sides of this conflict. They are both peopled by individuals who have particular quirks and who may not actually be entirely bad people. And so the reconciliation, I think, is a very individualist one, rather than an allegory for the state versus, anarchists. I think it's an individualist statement for me. I don't know what anyone else thinks about the.
No, I agree. I
agree as well. Yeah, I just I think it just brings up a lot of interesting points. I think that this is what's so rewarding of a moment of innocence is it's just got so much sort of depth to it and so much sort of texture to it that like there are so many interpretations you can take from it. And I think even there's the scene where they make like a joke about, oh, you have to speak in this dialect. And so I think it is a very kind of I like it because it's a very Iranian film in terms of it's not trying to appeal outside of Iran. Like it's like I'm going to be true to the experiences of the people here.
So let's summarize. What do we all think of A Moment of Innocence? Dawn.
It's a film that feels so effortless in its construction and exploration of fact and fiction and past and present and perspective and memory, forgiveness, that manages to somehow also be funny and moving. So it's really impressive and really thought-provoking. And I think I kind of saw the end in two different ways. I think I saw it how I first viewed it, and then after kind of reading about it, I maybe looked at it kind of differently. I think you can see lots of different things in it. So yeah, what more do you want from a film that's 75 minutes long?
Yeah, I loved it. I had no preconceptions going in. Thankfully, I know just enough about the Iranian Revolution to understand that that's what it was about, although it never quite explains that. I think that it works on the microcosm of Iranian culture in a way that maybe I'm not perceptive enough or knowledgeable enough to understand, but I could understand that it really knew the particulars of that culture and appreciated the particulars of that culture and was very interested in it, and that was engaging in itself. And it also had these grand universal themes of the individual against the establishment and the idea that the establishment is people by individuals, and it had a very fair and even hand that I appreciated. I thought it was it was a real thinker, and I thought that the formal experimentation complemented the themes and the discussion that it was having. And the relationships in the film were very believable and very compelling to watch, and it was very likeably acted. And as we've mentioned, or maybe not enough, it's a very funny film.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a huge amount. Sorry, I've just kicked over some water. I don't know if I've got a huge amount to add to what's already been said, but it moved me, and it was another one that made me think about it for quite a few days afterwards. Contemplating kind of all the different angles and turns it takes, and who was in the right, who was in the wrong, whose story was more honest. And I read somewhere, and I'm going to steal it, best freeze frame ending since 400 Blows, and that's probably right.
What about Staying Alive?
Yeah, true.
Don't even mention that film, Jesus.
Yeah, Chris.
I really liked it. I'd never really heard about it before. I think I would recommend people to check it out. I think it's a very human film. It's very interested in people and their fallibilities, and it takes that in kind of two different directions. One is a more kind of reflective sort of thinking through of like conflict and sort of trying to renegotiate that. And one of them is just being like, look at these silly people. Let's have a wee like chuckle at like their foibles, but in quite a sort of understanding way. And so it ends up being, it deals with some sort of serious subjects, but with a very sort of light hand. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely a gem.
It is. So let's vote. I'll go first then, shall I? This week is a really interesting one for me because it's probably more than any other week, the week that I've found myself liking every single one of the films more because of the discussion. So it was interesting to me with Lumiere and company, like hearing Chris describe the reasons why he really, really likes it. And I feel like I would probably take more kind of considering that when I was watching it. Same with Reservoir Dogs, same with Portrait of I, all of these things. Having said that, hasn't changed my view. I would still vote for Before Sunrise as the best film of the 90s. It means the most to me. I could watch Jesse and Celine wander around cities and talk for days and days and days. I don't know how much knowing what comes next affects that, but ultimately it doesn't really matter because I do know what comes next. So yeah, Before Sunrise for me is one of my favourite films of all time, and I think that the characterizations, dialogue, the on-screen chemistry are really amazing, and I could watch it over and over again and have done in my life. Chris?
So my favourite film of the 90s is the assembly cut of Alien 3, but I was told that I wasn't allowed to include that because technically it was released on DVD in 2003. But if I'm not allowed to say Alien 3, then I will instead say Lumiere and Company instead, because it's one of those films where it's like there are obviously elements which are not perfect. There's obviously elements like I would like to watch it in a very specific way. But as a piece of art, I feel like you should be allowed to view it in the way that you want to. And so I love all the short films. I love the diversity. I love the creativity. And I'm a huge, like, it might not be for everyone because like I'm personally a huge sort of early film fan, and like I've written quite a lot about it. And so I find people who you see as like great directors or like interesting directors in the present day trying to go back and reconnect to film's origins, very rewarding on multiple levels.
Don?
I guess for me it's probably between A Moment of Innocence and Reservoir Dogs, and I find them both very entertaining and I can get a lot out of both of them. But I guess since I have only seen A Moment of Innocence just the once a few weeks ago, I'm probably have to gonna stick with Reservoir Dogs because it also does mean a lot to me, and it just constantly surprises me every time I watch it.
Okay.
This is the rhythm of the night. The night. Oh yeah. Have a guess.
Lumiere and Company.
Yeah, that's the one.
All right, there we go. That's the end now.
Travail. It's amazing. I think that Beau Travail is an amazing meditation on so many different themes, and I absolutely love the acting, absolutely love the cinematography, absolutely love the script. It has a sense of class about itself, and it has one of the finest endings, I think, genuinely in all of cinema for me. I absolutely love it.
So
I would like to say though that like despite we all have these like different films and I think they reflect our different taste in films, I think it's quite interesting that I think each of us maybe didn't like one of them as much as the others, but we all loved Moment of Innocence. So while none of us are picking it, it might be the best film because it crosses over all our perspectives the most.
A Moment of Innocence has created a reconciliation between all of us.
Yeah.
As combating troops against each other.